going to the Father. The Gospel of the Lord.
I have just one question to ask this afternoon. Would anyone ever trip over you? Would anyone ever trip over you? I know it sounds like a ridiculous question, but I mean this sincerely. Would anyone ever trip over you? Today in our second reading, St. Peter, he quotes Psalm 118. He tells us that Jesus is the stone that is rejected by the builder, the stone that's found to be unfit, the stone that's disregarded and tossed away. While that same stone becomes the cornerstone in the spiritual house of a believer, Peter tells us that it's a stumbling block to the unbeliever, something to be tripped over. So would anyone trip over you? I think it's a fair question to ask. If Jesus is the stone rejected by the builder, should we not also be the stone that's rejected perhaps by our own society? If Christ is a stumbling block to unbelievers, should not Christians be a stumbling block to maybe even our own brothers and sisters and neighbors? I want to briefly reiterate a story I'm certain I've told at some point or another, but I think it bears repeating whether you've heard it before or not. In 2016, my sister, Mary Kate, she graduated from Notre Dame. And while most of her classmates immediately went out looking for prestigious, high-paying jobs, Mary Kate applied to be a full-time missionary for a group called A Simple House. She would be living in Washington, D.C. in a house that had no air conditioning, no television, no internet, virtually no comforts at all, hence a simple house. And she would spend her days kind of driving from one project housing complex to another, just befriending and serving the poor in Washington, D.C. The day after her graduation, we drove up to Chicago to spend some time together before I had to catch a flight out of O'Hare. And during the drive, we were just talking about a lot of things, but we talked about missionary work. We talked about what we believed it looked like to live a gospel life here in the 21st century. We talked about what we wanted from our own lives as Catholic Christians. And my sister said something that sticks with me to this day, and I'm sure I'll never forget it. She said, "I want to live my life in a way that makes absolutely no sense if God doesn't exist. I want to live my life in a way that would make absolutely no sense if God did not exist." And I've thought about that so many times since that day, but now I think about it, I think in a new way. She was essentially saying exactly what St. Peter is saying today in our reading. I want to be the stone that's rejected. I want to be a stumbling block in the eyes of the world. I want to live my life in a way that would make no sense whatsoever if God did not exist. There are obviously a lot of issues facing the church these days, but you want to know what I think is the most significant one? The lives of so many Christians make way too much sense apart from God. The lives of so many Christians make way too much sense apart from God. Think about it. In the grand scheme of things, many of our lives are largely unobtrusive. Our lives might blend in with the lives of our non-Christian friends or family members. Generally speaking, our lives sometimes don't look that much different from anybody else's. It's hard to tell a Christian from a non-Christian these days, and that certainly shouldn't be the case, right? If there was no God, would anything look different in some of our lives? I fear that maybe the answer sometimes is no. But truly, many of us are not really a stumbling block to anything. On the contrary, sometimes we seem to go out of our way to try to prove to people that Jesus is completely inoffensive, right? That he fits right in with the rest of the world. What are the morals of our culture? Well, how convenient. Those are the morals of Jesus. How about that? How does our culture define happiness? Well, isn't that great? Jesus defines happiness in the exact same way. What does our world say about salvation? Perfect. Jesus says the same thing. He's right on board with that. A few years ago, one of my classmates gave a terrific one-sentence homily. I like to think he was trying to be profound, but in actuality, he probably just forgot he was supposed to preach, so he made something up off the top of his head. Either way, it worked, right, because I remember it now. He stood up in front of our House of Studies in Washington, D.C. at our morning Mass, and he said this. He said, if someone met you, who would they think Jesus is? If someone met you, who would they think that Jesus is? It's a great question, isn't it? I think about that a lot. If someone looked at you, who would they think that Jesus is? Would they think that he's nobody of consequence? A do-gooder, a wise teacher, a stone that kind of just slides easily into the facade that kind of stands affront our oftentimes wounded culture? Or is he God? Or is he God? Does Jesus fit right into the typical way of doing things and thinking about things? Or does he present to us something completely new, something that very well might be misunderstood, something that might be rejected, something that might be tripped over? One of the friars I once lived with used to emphasize the same thing over and over again in so many of his homilies. He said, Jesus is fundamentally different from any other religious leader who has ever lived. While many have come claiming to be God or to be representatives of God and have claimed to people, this is the way, and they've written about what people should do to be happy and achieve some sort of salvation, saying this is the way, Jesus is the only one who comes and says, I am the way. I am the way. He doesn't give us a path to follow. He gives us a life to imitate. And what is the life of Jesus? It's a stumbling block. It's a stumbling block. That's what St. Peter tells us today. It's not a life of worldly virtue, but a life of beatitude, a life of heavenly virtue, a life that turns things upside down. It's not a life spent accumulating accolades and possessions. It's a life spent in imitation of the high priest who sacrifices everything, even himself, for both his friends and his enemies, and makes constant intercession in prayer for both. It's not a life of comfort and personal ambition. It's a life of discomfort and constant abandonment to the will of God. It's not a life of self-preservation. It's a life of dying to self in hope of the resurrection to come. It's not a life spent enveloped in noise and distraction. It's a life spent seeking silence, seeking peace, seeking interior conversion that can only come through communion with God. This type of life is a stumbling block. If you believe that Jesus is truly God and you live in imitation of him in all of these ways, in all of these things, people will trip over you. And that's not a bad thing. I know it sounds like it could be a bad thing, but think about it. You're never more awake than in that one millisecond when you're lying in bed and you feel all of a sudden like you're falling, right? A runner never has more adrenaline than in the moment his feet get tangled over a competitor and he's lifting himself off of the track after falling down. Nothing knocks a person out of complacency and comfort faster than tripping and falling to the ground. Is the Lord calling you to be a stumbling block in the life of someone close to you? Maybe someone close to you is meant to be your stumbling block. Maybe we're all meant to just be tripping over each other. Wouldn't that be a wonderful thing? Because once you stumble over Jesus, you have a choice to make. He's either a stone to be rejected, or he's the cornerstone. He's either nothing or he's everything. And what happens when we have a group of people who believe that Jesus is everything, who believe that Jesus truly is the Lord, that he truly is God, that he truly is who he says he is? Well, then we have a spiritual house. That's what Peter tells us. We have a spiritual house, a church, and not a church that hides, not a church that is afraid, not a church that seeks to fit in, but a church that stands apart from the world as a light in the darkness.